Now, for the people of Trinity, the gospel would have sounded familiar this morning. And it sounds familiar because it is an escalation of conversations that have been taking place along the way. I think it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, we looked at the disciples arguing over who was the greatest and Christ's instructions as a consequence. The Gospels sound familiar because they tell a familiar story. It speaks of a human or common human disposition where organizations, communities, institutions endeavor to meet up with an individual quest for power and authority. Now, just a few weeks ago, we spoke about round 1 of the succession plan that formed the discussion of the disciples when Jesus began speaking of his betrayal, death, and resurrection. We considered the disciples' argument on the road, and their argument was no surprise to Jesus. He knows that his words introduce a crisis in leadership. He knows that if he is to leave, he has to be replaced in some form. He knows that laying this out to his disciples will necessarily inspire the kind of conversation that the disciples had. If Jesus is taken, who will replace him? Now, a few weeks ago, the disciples were silent because they were embarrassed. Jesus didn't have to wait for them to tell him what they were talking about. Of course, they were sorting out who was the greatest. They were succession planning. And when you succession plan, you pick the person you want to lead based on their ability and upon their vision and upon their character. What do we do after Jesus is gone? Who do we want to lead us? Jesus helps them chart a path toward the character of this movement. Now, today's gospel sounds a lot like the gospel a few weeks ago. However, today is different. Before, the disciples were silent because they had argued with one another as to who was the greatest. They were embarrassed. This morning, however, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him. And they were very forward indeed. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Now, James and John are undisguised. Their ambition is naked. Where before the disciples were in the discussion together, this is now James and John breaking away to make a pitch for themselves. Now, who hasn't seen something like this? The disciples had been discussing who was the greatest. If they were considering who would lead them after Jesus was gone, this is natural and to be expected. Now, it's an unpleasant discussion, to be sure, so they want to remain out of earshot of Jesus. But this is natural and necessary. However, this morning, it would seem that the discussion is not going the way James and John want. It seems the names of James and John are not receiving sufficient support amongst the other 10 disciples. So James and John exercise a common strategy when the discussion of the whole team is not going the way you want. They pull the leader aside during coffee break or some other opportune time before the decision is made, and they bend his ear in a sidebar discussion. So Jesus, what do you think of the way the discussion is going so far? Wouldn't it be better if we jump right to the obvious solution, no matter what the rest of the disciples think? Appoint us, James and John, as co-regents in your coming kingdom. And of course, this is divisive. When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. Jesus says, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? His question is, are you qualified? And they replied, we are able. And Jesus says, the cup I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. So to the question, are you qualified? Are you technically able? Do you have the skill and experience? Well, perhaps you do. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Qualified? Perhaps. Technically able? Perhaps. Possessing skill and experience? Perhaps. But what of your character? James and John were not elected or appointed to sit on Jesus' right and left hand. The character they lacked was that of a servant. By pushing themselves to the front for the sake of themselves, James and John demonstrate themselves unfit. James and John, having a lust for power, prove themselves unworthy for it. Creating discord amongst their partners in this enterprise meant that in this instance, they were not men of good report. Now Jesus, the church, the Masonic fraternity agree on this. Leadership finds its foundation in service. Now, Masons make a pledge to God and the fraternity. The fraternity, a fellowship, a community, has as its main mandate to make good men better. Not for their own sake alone, but for the sake of the whole. This speaks not only to those who are qualified, but to those who are of good report. Now, if you're a Mason, being well qualified is something the fraternity helped you with. At your initiation, you were well or properly qualified or prepared with the assistance of others. Being a person of good report, being a person of good character, that was up to you. Possessing faith in God and being a person of good report, this describes the stone that can be trimmed and polished with skill and experience. possessing faith in God and being a person of good report, describes the character that truly qualifies one for leadership. And this is why Masons come from all walks of life. The common thread is character, not station. This is why every person is equally capable and encouraged to take on the responsibility of leadership. The character of the servant is not limited by choice of profession, social position, other qualifications, or any other honor. The church and the Masonic fraternity are about service, not power. Our bodies, therefore, must be populated with and led by servants. The Masonic fraternity allows no person to hold an office for themselves, and Masons practice this. The disciples clamoring for power were taught this by Jesus. I was surprised getting ready for this morning to learn that the lesson Jesus taught 2,000 years ago is credited to Robert K. Greenleaf in The Servant as Leader, an essay that he published in 1970. In that essay, Greenleaf said, "A servant leader focuses primarily on the growth and well-being of people and the communities to which they belong. While traditional leadership generally involves the accumulation and exercise of power by one at the top of the pyramid, servant leadership is different. The servant leader shares power, puts the needs of others first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible." That was 1970. 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." The foundation of Masonic fellowship is based on mutual respect and aid, not power, position, or authority. The Church of Christ is likewise founded. Let us be faithful in living out these truths in our community and in our world. Amen.